The last one, I was looking for historical references to just the Ozark Chinquapin, or something that I thought was large enough to be an Ozark Chinquapin. I'm going to do a little bit of lateral thinking on this one. Some of it is direct quotes, direct observation, but there are some things that are not as direct when it comes to history and the Ozarks and the Appalachians. Things are not always quite that simple and convenient, and we'll talk about more of that in a little bit. I work for the Missouri Department of Conservation, so I'm the guy that really likes the outdoors. I like plants, I like animals, I like studying their natural history, but I also have a passion about cultural history. And in particular, it's how do those two things mix? How do people interact with the natural world? How do we make use of things? What's the benefit and value to us? I'm not one of those folks that thinks you have to have a value to say something is worth saving, because that's not the case. However, it does make it a lot easier when you start to realize that you have a plant or an animal that's very vital. And so with the Ozark Chinquapin, it's a pretty easy case to make. And as time has gone on, I've uncovered more and more legitimate reasons to say this plant has current and historical value. And so that's a trip I'm going to take you on. This work is in part fueled by Chris Wyatt from the Arkansas Forestry Division. He has done a lot of research that I was able to sit down and read everything he gave me. Chris, if you're thinking that you sent that out and nobody read it, man, I read everything. I underlined stuff. I used sticky notes to say this is what this is about, indexed it, typed it up. I mean, I just really had a heyday with that, and I never would have had the time to do it myself, so I appreciate what you did. Some of the past uses, I want to make sure that you understand, I'm talking about the whole tree. The nuts are probably the most famous for use, but the leaves, the bark, the wood, and the burrs all have uses. And what I'm going to do is go through some of those, and I want to discuss them and talk about them. And hopefully you'll get a much richer appreciation for how important this tree was in the past and how important it could be in the future. So as I'm talking about uses, you have to start where the tree really catches you. My first interaction with this tree was tasting a nut that Steve Bost handed me and says, well, here, try one. And I remember tasting that and going, wow, this is awesome. I want more of these trees around. And that's, I think, everybody's reaction who eats one. If you take a look at some of the historical references, the oral histories that we've collected over the years, and just stories we've heard from people at various meetings, people will tell you first and foremost, the nut was tasty. They liked it. It was, it's not bitter. You don't have to do anything to it like you do with acorns. You can eat acorns, but you have to leach out the tannins. That's not the case with this little nut. It's tasty as is. You just have to remove it from its shell. The nuts were collected by school children for food. That's a story I hear quite a bit. People would talk about putting the Chinquapins in their pocket, and that was their lunch. And this is Depression era discussion, so it would have been the 1930s and even into the 1940s. People would collect those. Sometimes the Chinquapin trees were close to school, so they would make use of that as a food resource. I hear a lot of stories about feeding hogs and other livestock. And if you read in some of the old newspaper clippings, that's something else you hear a lot of. People were getting that and they were selling these for a particular price, and it was used to fatten up livestock before the butchering in October or November. Of course, they were eaten raw. And what I found interesting is that you even see a lot of references to a cash crop, and I'll get into some detail here with that in just a moment. Here's a quote I wanted to share because I thought it was pretty awesome. I remember coming home on a school bus, and there was some big old Chinquapins along the road. The ground would turn black from the Chinquapins. The bus driver would stop and let us get out and gather Chinquapins. Boys would put them in their pockets while girls would pull up their dresses to make a bit of a pouch to hold theirs. And that's a story from Kenneth Ruark about the Ozarks in the 1940s. I just love the imagery of the ground being black from all the Chinquapins that have fallen off of one of these trees. That creates quite an image. And as I looked through some of the newspapers, it would make the newspaper in someone saying, well, we had some visitors from out of town and we went hunting Chinquapins. I remember one of them that said, we went out for Chinquapins, came back with chiggers. This is the kind of stuff that made the newspaper back in the day. And it gave you an idea of this was part of the annual cycle. People would go out and collect Chinquapins socially. They would do it for their individual needs. They would do it for their livestock, and then they would even do it to sell. Now, take a look at this. They would make black pearls or brown pearls, or maybe I should say chestnut pearls. It was not uncommon all across the deep South, even into Arkansas, to make nut necklaces. And I will admit that some of these references may be talking specifically about the Allegheny Chinquapin, but the ones that are in Louisiana and getting into Arkansas could have just as easily been from an Ozark Chinquapin. And I think that's fantastic stuff. A couple of quotes there on the prices. Chinquapins were 13 cents per pound, a string on the market for 5 cents. And we've got an article posted on the Chinquapin website that goes into just the Chinquapin necklaces and what kind of a little cultural tidbit that was at one time. And there's even one about a bride who wanted to be decorated with Ozark Chinquapin nuts as a necklace around her neck. I find that kind of stuff endearing and just a wonderful insight to how this tree was part of people's lives. Take a look at these prices. From 1873 to 1959, all kinds of different ways this is listed. For example, the 5 cents for a necklace, 10 cents for a quart, and there were price ranges anywhere from 10 to 15 cents on a quart. There was one in there, I think you go a little further down, about halfway. Somebody had sold a complete 2 bushels and 1 peck for $17.55. But when you get down to it, the prices were pretty conservative as far as how much were you talking about per nut. I love the one down there about somebody was selling a matchbook full of them, about 10 cents for the matchbox. So just, especially during the Great Depression, which extended from the 20s and 30s into the Appalachians and the Ozarks, it was a very long time period for them. They didn't really know that anybody else was doing any better. But if you had some extra, you would try to sell them as best you could, then use that to buy something else. The leaves were pretty valuable. This is a story that we've shared in years past from Kenneth Ruark. His children were sick with the whooping cough, and his dad, who was part Cherokee, said, well, listen, you need to go out and get some Chinquapin leaves, and told him how to process them. And I have a quote there from Kenneth that said, Dad told me to collect Chinquapin leaves and boil them to make tea. It'll be bitter, so add honey. Each cough, stick a spoon in their mouth. In other words, give them a dose every time they cough. Give it to them lots and often. And then furthermore, he said, my dad said this was an old remedy that came from out east with chestnut leaves, and as a chestnut relative, it'll work the same. That's a real important concept to keep in mind. The people who settled in the Ozarks over here in Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, they were from the Appalachians. They were the same batch of people. So anything they knew about in the Appalachians, if there was the same species or a relative over here, a lot of those uses would translate. And you have to keep in mind that these were people that a lot of their life's knowledge was passed down from parents, grandparents, uncles, and other folks in a community. And that's largely what their education was. They weren't getting their education as much from school. Of course, that was for reading and writing, but the rest of their life knowledge came from people telling them, here's what this is, here's how you can use it, this is how you process it. So when they moved from the Appalachians to the Ozarks, they brought with them their knowledge. And even though we don't have chestnuts, we have a chestnut relative, and that translates. And there are some other items like that I'm going to show you. So even though you'll see some quotes that deal specifically with Castanea pumila, the Allegheny Chinquapin, there is the potential, and in some cases, a very solid argument to say people in the Ozarks did the exact same thing. If you're going to make your own tea, right now would be a great time to collect leaves, dry them out, use a small word processor, not word processor, you can tell I'm a digital age kid, a food processor, chop up the leaves, and then you can put those in some little tea material, steep that in some hot water, and then sweeten it with honey, as they said, and it makes a nice tea. I've had a number of cups of that, and it is quite tasty. And apparently it even does good to treat cough. That's something that has been reasonably well acknowledged, that it does have properties that are good for that. but you're not going to see a lot of doctors prescribe a cup of Chinquapin tea. So if you decide to take that as a self-medication, use some common sense, talk to your doctor if you're going to do that. I'm not saying this will cure your cough. I'm just saying this is something that has quite a bit of potential, and it merits more research to see what's in there that helped cure whooping cough or get people to a point where they're no longer ill. Now, the Ozark Chinquapin is similar to the chestnut in that it does have a lot of insects that get on it. And we had a research project done by a master's student several years back, and he was able to exclude insects from certain flowers and exclude the wind from others. And what he found was that if you don't let the insects get in to deal with the flowers, the pollination is greatly reduced. And so it's real important to understand that all kinds of insects, including native bees and honeybees, make use of the pollen and the nectar that's on there. And here's an interesting quote from the Atlanta Constitution. And it said, they'll gather honeydew from broadleaf trees and nectar from Chinquapin, and your honey is as bitter as gall. Well, that caused me to do a little research, and what I have found, any honey that is made predominantly from the genus Castanea, whether it's European or North American, has just a little bit of a bitter aftertaste, which it depends on who you talk to. Some people say, oh, I like it. Others say, oh, I don't like it at all. And it's pretty obvious this particular newspaper editor didn't like them at all. But you can find chestnut honey online. Most of it is from Europe, a few sources here in the United States, and I have not found anybody who sells Chinquapin honey, but apparently all of it is going to be somewhat dark and a little bit bitter. As it turns out, the nuts can be used to do something besides eat. They can be used for other recipes. Here's one from the Atlanta Constitution that says depression coffee recipes about 45 years old are making a comeback. That was printed in 1977. And that particular recipe calls for a hatful of Chinquapins, wheat or barley, corn, and molasses brewed in a pot with clear branch water. Then it says strain through your teeth. Apparently there's a few granules in there the way they were doing it. Here's another one. The American Indian knew many uses for chestnuts and Chinquapins. From roasted nuts, a beverage was made. Thomas Ashe, writing of the Chinquapin, says, of the kernel is made chocolate, not much inferior to that of cocoa. Now, that's something I haven't tried. I would like to dig a little deeper into what that might be. I can't imagine that Chinquapins taste like cocoa, but they do have a sweetness to them, and that's undeniable. But this is the kind of stuff that you find if you keep digging. The people were very imaginative with how they would use something. It wasn't just about eating the nuts. They would use them for other things. Now, here's a use that I didn't anticipate. It was a cure for malaria. Now, one thing about malaria people need to understand is that malaria is an old world disease. It occurred in Africa. It occurred in other sections of the old world over there, but it did not occur naturally in North America until people who traveled across the ocean bringing barrels of what was at the time fresh water that had mosquito larvae in it. When they would arrive, the water really wasn't as fresh tasting as they would like. They would pour it out and get a new source. Well, in that old barrel of water would be the eggs and the larvae of the mosquito, and that's where we got our malaria in North America. So for a long time, up until the 1930s, people would try to find ways to cure malaria, and quinine was not always a common medicine. So if you didn't have it because it was in short supply or because it just didn't exist in your area, you would find a substitute. Now, if you take a look at this from the Times-Picayune from New Orleans, they talk about Dr. Nelson Burgrass of South Carolina has used a decoction of root and bark of the Chinquapin as a substitute for quinine and intermittent fevers with decidedly satisfactory results. Here's another one. This one came from Montgomery, Alabama. It says quinine was manufactured from dogwood berries, cottonseed tea, chestnut, and Chinquapin roots, willow bark, and poplar bark. Now, no specific recipes, but it just gives you an idea that the tannic acid that's found in both the roots and the bark were pretty important for making a quinine substitute. So anyways, just kind of an interesting look at how that goes. And these are the only two that I have found thus far. But that doesn't mean that you won't find that particular recipe elsewhere. And if it's something that would be reported upon in that manner, you can guarantee there was more word of mouth of that kind of thing. One that you hear quite a bit, especially in Arkansas and Missouri, is that the Chinquapins were used for fences. Now, initially, it would have been a split rail fence. In the Ozarks, you really don't want to have to dig a hole in some places unless you're absolutely made to because of all the rocks. So a split rail fence is a real smart idea because you don't have to dig a hole to put the fence up. You do have to have plenty of material, and that works out great when it's rot resistant, because otherwise a split rail fence is good for about a decade, and then after that you're going to have to replace it. Split rail fences were predominantly used to keep livestock out of gardens and orchards. The way we think of fences today, we fence livestock in, and in the old days they would fence the livestock out. It was just too much work to fence the livestock into a sizable area. Later on, as barbed wire was developed, fence posts were then put in the ground where they could be, and the Chinquapin, being a very rot-resistant material, was highly sought after. Long after other types of wood had rotted, the Chinquapin post would still be in place, firm and holding the fence just like a champ. And I do want to point out, here's an advertisement in Chariton County, Missouri, and it says fence post, we can deliver, and it lists a bunch of different locations, but it lists the wood as cedar, sassafras, black walnut, black locust, Chinquapin, white oak, pitch pine post for the best quality and smoothest surfaces. And what they're listing there are all the woods that are fairly rot resistant to some degree. And I find it interesting that the Chinquapin was listed there. But because the Ozark Chinquapin was much larger, railroad ties were also a very common thing to request or to sell. This particular newspaper advertisement announces to timbermen, cross ties wanted. A proposal will be received, and we read some of this from Nashville Patriot. And essentially, they described the size on the ties and how big they were. And this was out of the Nashville and the Kentucky area. Now, in Missouri, you'll see similar advertisements, not quite as elaborate or descriptive, but they were using post oaks, Chinquapins, anything that was rot resistant. They wouldn't have to change on a regular basis, keep the tracks stable and maintenance free as possible. That rot resistance was valuable for more than fences and railroads. People would actually, if they had a nice grove of them, they would cut those down, and they would use that for cabin logs if it was a small little cabin for just a man and his wife and a few kids. If they were near a sawmill, they might saw them up for siding, board and batten style, much like what you see in this picture. They also would take stumps and then they would rive out shingles. And when I say rive out, I'm talking about using a mallet and a froe. And you're essentially using the wood that you wouldn't make use of that was higher quality for the building. You would use the stump to be able to make your shingles. And then you could also make caskets, something that would not rot quickly. That was their version of keeping everything together. Furthermore, on making use of the wood, it did have similarities to the American chestnut. And if you read up on musical instruments, the American chestnut was prized for being used with white walnut or the black walnut to make an instrument. And you see here, Mike Holmes has made a couple of these with Ozark Chinquapin wood. And beautiful instruments. They have a very distinctive sound. People who make dulcimers can tell you the differences in the sound and the richness. And they do have a very specific sound to them. I've tried my own hand at it. I'm no master at it, but it does make an appreciable noise that is enjoyable to play, enjoyable to listen to. As I dug a little deeper, I found out that there are lots of different uses for Chinquapin wood. Now, this one is one of those where I'm using some lateral thinking here. This particular advertisement said that they were looking for timber wanted, the hoop poles 4 feet long of birch or Chinquapin. Now, this was from Richmond in Virginia. And although it was probably mostly the use of the Allegheny Chinquapin, there is the possibility that the Ozark Chinquapin was used for this, but I'm not trying to stretch anything. But what I need you to understand is that if they're doing something in the Appalachians, Keep in mind, the people from the Appalachians, when they move over here to the Ozarks, they were doing the same thing. And I had a conversation with National Park archaeologist, Dr. Jim Price. He worked in Van Buren, Missouri. And we were talking about different uses of wood and comparing what goes on in the Appalachians, where they have a little better documentation of what was used and how it was done. And in the Ozarks, sometimes we just really don't have a lot of documentation. These kind of things fell out of use before anybody had any kind of attention toward it. We didn't have a Foxfire magazine, and the Bittersweet magazine was maybe a little further down the line. So some of these uses and folk knowledge were not quite as common, and they weren't documented very well. Well, Dr. Price told me, you have to keep in mind, AJ, that these uses were pretty conservative. When these people moved over here from the Appalachians, they brought their knowledge with them, and they used what was over here, just like they would have out east. And the only reason they wouldn't use it is if it didn't work, because they were practical people. And that meant a lot to me. So there are some things that you can make some educated guesses. And I am going to be upfront with you about this, that I don't have documentation that says the Ozark Chinquapin was used this way, but I know Ozark people, they're clever and they're pretty industrious. And if they think something can be done with a particular item, they will do it. And the only reason they won't is because it doesn't work. And if you see this barrel right here, this is called a piggin because it actually has a handle on it. It is bound not with iron hoops, but with white oak. And it would not be that much of a stretch in the imagination to say that that could have been Chinquapin wood that was used to do that. And to give you an idea of some of the barrels in Virginia that were used with those hoop poles, by the way, Merriam-Webster dictionary defines a hoop pole as a straight, slender length of green sapling wood, usually of hickory or white oak, that was formerly used as stock for barrel hoops. In this case, Chinquapins were used as they were advertising. And you can see with this longer barrel and the shorter one, they are both bound together with hoops made of wood. Now, in this particular instance, this is what I would call Ozark Chinquapin wood because it's from Missouri. And this particular newspaper article says they want good 39-inch white oak and Chinquapin stave bolts for our mill on Highway 19 at the Denton-Shannon County line, National Distillers. So they were making barrel staves, which are the individual pieces of wood that make the barrel. And the interesting thing about this, these are distillers, and you have to have very specific wood if you're going to make watertight barrels, or what we call cooperage. So the white oak I know that white oak has a reputation of, if you make something out of white oak, it will not leak as long as you make sure your seams are good. Obviously, Chinquapin wood has the exact same feature, or else you wouldn't be able to make a barrel out of it. Because, for example, you can make a barrel out of red oak, and it'll be great for nails. It'll be great for grain, but you can't put any water in it because red oak will not hold water, even if the seams are really good. The wood itself will act like a sieve, and it will leak. So white oak and Chinquapin had a distinctive advantage. Here's some other nice entries about the wood. Chinquapin wood was used for ox yokes, and you can see a sample of one right above on the top. That's what an ox yoke would have looked like. They also mentioned that it was a favorite wood for the cook stove. Now, the wood does explode. When I say explode, it pops. And that's no good if you're going to put it in a campfire or an outside fire. But if you put it in a wooden cook stove, that popping doesn't do anything bad at all. Apparently, it would make just the right heat for cooking on one of those old wood fire stoves. Mr. Benson Fox continues to say, my uncle built a rocking chair, and he'd done a pretty good job. He made it outside of the house, and when it was finished, he started to take it in the house. It would not go in any of the doors, too wide. So it sat on the front porch for the rest of its life. He made it from Chinquapin wood. I love that story. It's got quite a bit of humor, and I could see myself pulling a similar stunt. I put all this love and time into a rocking chair, and I forgot to measure will it fit and go in the house. Just a beautiful story. I've reported in the past that there are some atlatls that have been discovered in southwest Missouri, and one archaeology student was able to look at the wood and examine it and say, you know, I'm pretty certain this is Ozark Chinquapin wood, which is part of the reason that it survived as long as it did. And I've made a few replicas of what that would have looked like. So it's been used by people for a very long time. Now, I want to mention the riverboat one more time. If you were here for my presentation on the range, I wanted to talk about that because you don't build a boat out of a shrub. But the interesting thing here is that he specifically wants Chinquapin for the hull of the boat. And I find that to be very fascinating because it lines up with the use for the staves on the barrels that were watertight. So apparently Chinquapin not only is rot resistant, but it's waterproof. And if it's crafted properly, it makes an outstanding water resistant boat hull. And we talked a little bit about that 30,000 board feet and 115 trees. So you're dealing with, you've got to cut quite a few trees down, saw them up, and make your boat. And by the way, when I did all those calculations, I worked with one of our foresters, and I asked whether we're using the international scale or the Doyle scale. The Doyle scale was in use in 1895. The international scale didn't come around until about 1900. So my numbers are based on Doyle scale for all the foresters out there. In the past, I've talked a little bit about the dyeing. Native dyes were available to a lot of people. This was an article that in part was talking about dyeing baskets, and it said the most popular dyes were pecan root, chinquapin, walnut, maple, hickory, and sumac berries. And all of these items will give you very distinctive colors. And what they're doing is dyeing the basket making material before it was woven into the basket. So the Chinquapin was probably used to generate a purple or a type of brown, maybe a tan or something of that nature. It depends on what they had for their mordants. There wasn't a lot of description of that, but obviously you could take honeysuckle and dye that because that's what they were talking about at the time, and dye your materials for your basket. In other discussions, it was used to dye cotton cloth. Unbleached muslin, according to one lady who was describing her memories, was used for making of many of our clothes. In other words, they would get bolts of this, sew their own dresses, and she described it as a drab ecru. Muslin just has kind of a tan brown color that you wouldn't want all your clothes to look like that. And she's asking the rhetorical question, who wants a drab ecru colored dress? She goes on to say, our mother was a very smart woman as well as resourceful. She improvised ways of prettying up our dresses with the aid of Chinquapin bark for dye. This drab cloth would turn to purple. And for those of you who remember from last year, I've tried some of this myself, and I was able to dye cloth purple with the bark, but I also was able to pull off similar results by using the burrs, the leaves, and just differences in how you treat it. And right here is I almost have a visual matrix of some wool. The top row was all dyed with leaves and well water. And then if you look at the columns, the left column is dyed with material that's stated plus alum. The middle column is copper, and the one on the right is iron. The picture doesn't do it real justice. It's kind of almost a blackish purple in both those instances. The one that has the bark is much lighter. I don't know if it's because I used bark or if it's because I used rainwater, which would have been maybe pH acidic or neutral, and my well water is calcium laden, so it would have been pH basic. I haven't done enough experiments to be able to say what the difference was on that. But bottom line is, even though people cite using the bark, you certainly can use the leaves and the burrs, and I feel better about using that because that's renewable. Right now is a wonderful time to collect leaves and spent burrs. Just boil them and use them to dye whatever you want with cotton. The tannins will pre-mordant the cotton. You have to have tannins to get it kind of cleansed. And they work great for that. I've dyed wool, which I've made into finger woven sashes, and the purples in all these sashes were made from Ozark Chinquapin wool. I'm sorry, Ozark Chinquapin burrs to dye the wool. Lastly, and this is something I think Leslie and I were talking about during a break, that the Ozark Chinquapin wood and bark were used to tan leather. In this particular article, there was a reference specifically to the Ozark Chinquapin, and it says the Eastern Regional Research Laboratory in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania has analyzed samples of Ozark Chinquapin wood and bark and has found that as a source of tannin, a block of Chinquapin is practically equivalent of chestnut, which at one time was the principal tannin source in the country. Now that's an article from Arkansas. So someone obviously took a chunk of this and they sent it off to find out what value there was in it. And if you get to looking about vegetable tanning or just tanning of leather in the United States, chestnuts were used quite a bit for hide tanning. It's a pretty ecologically friendly way to tan hides, and it does give a rich brown color. This is not a picture of chestnut from North America, but a chestnut was used to dye that particular leather in that photograph, but it's from Europe. And anything that you would get from North America would be of comparable color. Because of the time period, you would have to leave it in the mixture to get that tanning process completed. All right, well, wrapping this up. The tree is valuable. I would say this tree is valuable even if I don't understand what value it poses in the ecosystem or to us. I think that any kind of species that's native has value, and you could just stop right there as far as I'm concerned. But that being said, I'm still fascinated with what we find to do with some of these things, and I love uncovering the values that are there. And from what I've shown you today, I hope that I've convinced you that the nut is valuable, the leaves are valuable, the bark is valuable, the roots are valuable, the wood is certainly valuable, and even those pointy, prickly burrs, which stick your fingers, have value. Now, if you want to argue with me about this, I'm not going to hold it against you, but the bottom line is, folks, I really do think this tree is valuable, and there's a lot of uses for the tree. And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions, if there are any.
There haven't been any posed in the chat.
All right. If anyone's interested in these types of uses, we have a few articles on the Ozark Chinquapin Foundation website that goes into, for example, making of a dulcimer, doing the dye work. I don't have the comprehensive list put on there, but that may be future work that I put on there. Just, I need to find good consumable ways to put that on there. Obviously, this will be on YouTube when we get it posted. And the bottom line is there's a lot out there. And I think that there's probably more if we do digging. I think we're going to be rewarded with figuring out there's more uses. But you have to keep in mind that folks didn't really spend a lot of time interviewing the Ozarks residents to find out what they were doing. They were looked upon as backwards and simple. And it was really the newspapers of the day that did any recording of what people did or what they were doing. And sometimes it was just indirect. This is a commercial product and we're looking for it. So as you get to looking into this particular tree, it had a lot of value in the past. And if it ever gets restored, some of those past uses could be future uses. Me, myself, I want to see how it does making a longbow. And I would love to rive some pieces off like you would white oak strips and weave a basket. I really think it would be possible, and it would be an awesome thing to be able to say, yeah, this came from the Ozark Chinquapin too. Well, folks, I thank you very much for your time. Thanks for listening to me. If you do have questions, I would.
I do have one question that was posed now. Chris Wyatt asked, do you think anything American chestnut was used for Ozark Chinquapin could be used for as well?
That's a real good question. That has been my guidepost. I have noticed that if you did something with it historically, the chestnut, you would find a comparable use in the Ozarks that they were doing the exact same thing. And the wood has similar properties, both physically and chemically, and the nut, the leaves, and all that. So whenever you're left with an absence of direct evidence, the best guess would be if you can do it with a chestnut, you can do it with a Chinquapin.
All right. Thank you, AJ.
Thank you.